Imagine a map of the world, the kind you'd see hanging in old classrooms. Faded green seas, browned edges, and great swaths of land painted in deep, commanding red. That red wasn't decoration. It was domination. From the desert of Africa to the mountains of South Asia, red marked the reach of an empire so vast that people said the sun never dared set upon it. Ships bearing the Union Jack sliced through the oceans. Ports echoed with British voices, and London glowed as the central hub of global commerce. The textbooks paint this story as one of discipline, naval genius, industry, and innovation. They frame it as a grand narrative of bravery, exploration, and order. But beneath that polished surface lies a far more unsettling truth, one woven from shadowy finances, ruthless markets, covert transactions, and wealth gathered through means that polite history tries to ignore. The British Empire did not simply rise through courage or strategy. It rose on capital, immense, unrelenting capital. And much of that capital came from places modern history rarely dares to discuss openly. To understand how a relatively small island became the most powerful force on the planet, we must peel back the layers of myth and look deeper into machinery that powered empire. Money. Money made in counting houses, merchant offices, plantations, opium depots, trading ships, slave ports, and the private banks hidden behind London's respectable facades. Let's go back to the 1600s. England then was nothing like the global giant it later became. Spain and Portugal were swimming in treasure from the Americas. The Dutch dominated world trade with unmatched efficiency. France, with its population and land, was a continental titan. England, by contrast, was politically unstable, economically limited, and still recovering from internal turmoil. So how did this small island not only catch up to its rivals, but eventually surpass them? The answer lies not on battlefields, but in ledgers. In its willingness to embrace new financial tools, debt markets, monopolies, joint stock enterprises, and state-supported private companies, that turned empire from a national project into an investment opportunity. Take the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. At first glance, it seems like just another institution. But in reality, it was a revolutionary system that changed the trajectory of a nation. Instead of relying on unstable taxation or begging wealthy nobles for funds, the crown could now borrow enormous sums directly from private investors in return for guaranteed interest. For the first time, war could be financed like a business. Expansion could be planned without waiting for the treasury to fill. Empire could be placed on credit. And once Britain discovered that it could fight wars with money borrowed from its own citizens, the race for global domination accelerated. But this money was not clean, nor was it neutral. Much of it came from private corporations that functioned as the empire's unofficial armies. The most infamous of these was the East India Company. Part corporation, part army, part government, and entirely ruthless. Created in 1600 by royal charter, it started as a trading venture dealing in spices and silks. But backed by wealthy investors and protected by the British Crown, it evolved into a monstrous financial engine with the power to wage war, mint currency, enforce laws, and rule lands. Investors in London weren't simply buying spices. They were buying control over territories thousands of miles away. The East India Company's profits were staggering, not only from trade, but from controlling markets, manipulating local rulers, dictating prices, and eventually taxing millions of people in India. Shareholders weren't just collecting dividends. They were funding a private empire whose actions shaped global history. Britain's expansion in Asia was not driven solely by the state. It was driven by investors looking for returns. The line between public power and private profit almost disappeared. But the darkest financial foundations of the empire lay across the Atlantic. From the 17th to early 19th centuries, British ships transported millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. The cruelty is beyond calculation, but in the eyes of financiers of the time, it was a booming industry. Plantations in the Caribbean produced sugar, rum, cotton, and tobacco, commodities that generated colossal wealth for merchants and banks in London. Insurance companies like Lloyd's covered slave ships. Customs houses taxed plantation goods. Investors bought stakes in companies tied to slavery. Even after slavery ended, the British government compensated slave owners, not the enslaved, with massive payouts. That money didn't disappear. It circulated through Britain's financial system for generations. The empire's wealth had a dark heartbeat, and slavery was one of the main arteries feeding it. Meanwhile, financial families such as the Rothschild became essential pillars of the empire, not through military service but through loans. Governments needed funds for wars, railways, expeditions, and colonial administrations. These banking families provided the capital that kept the empire solvent. Insurance markets, ledgers, bonds, and complex financial contracts underpinned the British state more securely than any fortress. And the general public rarely saw the machinery behind this wealth. They saw cheap sugar, affordable textiles, exotic tea, and patriotic victories. But the financial underworld that made it all possible remained invisible. The fusion of finance and empire reached its most sinister expression in the opium trade. When Britain found itself losing silver in exchange for Chinese tea, it sought a commodity that China would buy. That commodity was opium, cultivated in India, trafficked by British merchants, and defended by British cannons. The result was mass addiction, political humiliation for China, and enormous profits for British financial networks. This wasn't merely trade. It was economic warfare, waged for the sake of balancing Britain's ledgers. By the 18th century, London had transformed. It wasn't just a political capital. It was the financial capital of the world. Money from colonies flowed into its banks. Wars were funded by bonds bought by ordinary citizens. Corporations acted as imperial arms. Investors speculated on the fate of nations. And behind it all, a small circle of merchants, bankers, and elites pulled the strings, shaping policies and profiting no matter the human cost. This was the real engine of the British Empire. Not noble ideals, but capital, often dark, hidden, and built on suffering. An empire of money as much as an empire of red on the map. By the time the 18th century dawned, the British Empire had already begun weaving together something far larger than a political project. It was creating a vast financial organism, an economic ecosystem so interconnected that the movement of a merchant ship leaving Calcutta or a caravan arriving at a port in West Africa might ripple all the way to the stock exchanges of London. If the empire was a body, its soldiers and sailors were the arms and legs, but its heart was the flow of capital and its bloodstream was credit. What made Britain different from the empires that came before wasn't simply size or military power. It was a seamless fusion of private fortunes, banking institutions, and state authority into one relentless machine. At the center of this machine was a tool Britain had mastered better than any rival: borrowing. Wars are expensive, and Britain fought more wars than almost any other European nation. From battles against Napoleon to skirmishes in distant colonies, the cost soared. Yet Britain avoided the bankruptcy that crippled Spain or the economic collapses that shook France because it had perfected a unique strategy, turning war into a kind of mass investment plan. Instead of relying solely on treasure or taxes, Britain issued bonds that citizens and elites eagerly bought. These government securities weren't just financial instruments. They were promises backed by the empire itself. When someone in London bought a bond, they were indirectly financing armies marching through India or ships patrolling the Caribbean. The empire became a shared financial venture, with risk spread across thousands of hands. But while ordinary people invested in empire, the true profits flowed upward. Bankers, industrialists, and merchant houses reaped enormous gains while burdens, higher taxes, military deaths, inflation, landed on common citizens. It was a brilliant and brutal system. The financial elite profit regardless of victory or defeat, while everyone else pays the price. Britain's genius was not simply in building a strong navy. It was in building a strong credit system. India became the linchpin of this financial strategy. After the East India Company collapsed following the rebellion of 1857, India came under direct crown rule. Many assumed this would reduce exploitation. The opposite happened. Under the Raj, India became the empire's financial keystone, a source of steady revenue that kept British global ambitions afloat. Taxes collected from poor Indian farmers didn't stay in India. They were converted into bills payable in London, funneled into British banks, and used to pay interest on British debt or fund new colonial ventures elsewhere. A farmer struggling to survive in Bengal was, unknowingly, helping finance railroad in Africa or military expeditions in Central Asia. One of the most insidious mechanisms was the home charges, a system of payments extracted yearly from India to cover costs Britain claimed were necessary for governing the colony. These charges included pensions for British officials, interest on public debt, and administrative expenses. In modern terms, billions of dollars left India each year to sustain Britain's economy. Little of that money ever returned in the form of development. Economic thinkers like Dadabhai Nehroji called this a drain of wealth, arguing that Britain wasn't enriching India, it was systematically bleeding it. London's financial world benefited immensely from this wealth. The reliable revenue from India made British bonds exceptionally safe in the eyes of investors around the world. Countries borrowed money through London banks because they trusted the stability that Indian revenues created. In essence, Britain's global banking supremacy rested heavily on the suffering of millions across the Indian subcontinent. But India wasn't the only gear in the imperial machine. Britain's Industrial Revolution added ferocious momentum to the enterprise. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham devoured raw materials from all corners of the empire: cotton, rubber, jute, coal, palm oil, and in return produced textiles, weapons, and machinery that were sold back to colonies. The empire provided both the resources and the markets. Finance acted as a lubricant that kept this engine running smoothly. Banks issued credit to merchants transporting cotton from Egypt. Insurance houses protected cargo from storms or rebellion. Joint stock companies floated shares for new mines in Australia or South Africa. Every financial transaction, every loan, every contract extended Britain's reach. But this system came at a horrific human cost. When the American Civil War disrupted cotton supplies, Britain desperately sought replacements. India and Egypt were forced to ramp up cotton production. Indian farmers were pushed into planting cash crops instead of food, leaving them vulnerable to famine. The consequences were brutal. Famine swept across India in the late 19th century. Millions died. Crop failures became humanitarian catastrophes. Yet for the London markets, these tragedies barely registered. The deaths were reduced in numbers on ledgers. Fluctuations in commodity prices. The cold logic of finance didn't pause for human lives. Africa, too, became entangled in Britain's expanding financial web. The so-called scramble for Africa in the late 19th century wasn't just about political rivalry. It was about money, speculation, and the search for new riches. When diamonds were discovered in South Africa or gold in the Transvaal, British investors raced to buy shares in mining companies. These companies promised astronomical profits, and money poured into the stock markets. But investment demanded stability, and stability required military force. It's no coincidence that conflicts like the Anglo-Zulu War or the Boer War erupted shortly after the discovery of valuable resources. Behind the rhetoric of bringing civilization lay a more direct motive: protect the interests of wealthy shareholders in London. China revealed another dimension of this dark financial empire. The Opium Wars weren't merely about trade rights. They were about correcting financial imbalances through coercion. Britain was losing silver to China in exchange for tea and silk. To reverse the flow, British merchants, with the tacit blessing of the government, pushed opium into Chinese markets. Millions became addicted. Social structures weakened. When Chinese authorities attempted to resist, Britain responded with military force, not to protect honor or national pride, but to protect profit. The opium trade became one of the ugliest intersections of finance and empire, drug money on a global scale, enriching merchants while destroying lives. Through all this, the average Briton remained largely unaware of the deeper mechanics. Newspapers celebrated victories, explorers, and exotic colonies. Few headlines revealed how deeply intertwined finance was with imperialism. The real decision-makers weren't the generals or politicians. They were the men in counting houses, the investors trading colonial stocks, the bankers crafting loans. These were the invisible architects of empire, shaping world events through the silent power of money. By the end of the 19th century, Britain's empire had transformed into something unprecedented. It was no longer just a territorial power. It was a financial superstructure that shaped global markets, dictated trade flows, and controlled resources across continents. The red on the map was only the surface. Underneath, in the ledgers and balance sheets, lay the true story of Britain's rise, A story built not only on ships and soldiers, but on the relentless pursuit of profit. The journey into the forgotten financial world of the ancient empires moves deeper as the camera slides across cracked tablets, half-faded scripts, and golden coins buried under centuries of dust. The voice slows, almost whispering, as if revealing a truth the world never learned. In the silent glow of torchlight, the world's first financial crises, first inflation waves, first market manipulations, and first debt prisons come into view, echoes of problems we still face today. Imagine a bustling marketplace under a scorching Mesopotamian sun. Merchants tug at their robes, women balance jars of grain, and scribes sit under cloth shades scratching numbers into wet clay tablets. A man, thin from hunger and frustration, kneels before a stern temple official. His voice breaks as he pleads for mercy. Behind him on a clay tablet, his debt is carved permanently. He owes grain borrowed during a bad harvest, but the interest is killing him. In ancient times, interest wasn't just a charge. It was a chain that tightened around your life. If you failed to pay, your land, your livestock, even your children could be taken. The narrator explains that the world's earliest interest rates were shockingly high, sometimes 20%, sometimes 33%, occasionally even 50% depending on the kingdom and crisis. The temples and palaces controlled loans, and they rarely lost. This was not kindness. It was control. The Sumerians wrote records of farmers losing everything after 2 winters of failed crops. Once they became debt slaves, their children inherited the burden. This was the earliest form of generational financial bondage. As the camera pans across the ruins of ancient Ur, the story shifts to a moment of unexpected humanity. Every few decades, kings issued a proclamation known as the Clean Slate. All debts wiped, all people freed, not out of kindness, but because the economy collapsed when too many citizens were enslaved by debt. Without workers, farms died. Without farmers, armies starved. Without armies, kingdoms fell. The lesson was brutal. Even in ancient times, economies failed when the working class drowned in debt. The past, it seems, has already lived our future. While Mesopotamia struggled with debt spirals, Egypt thrived on a system entirely different. The Nile's rhythm ruled everything. When it flooded, farms flourished. When it didn't, famine followed. The narrator describes a scene inside an Egyptian granary. Towering walls of grain stacked under the watch of priests. Grain that was not food, it was currency. It was wealth. The pharaoh's officials measure harvest with a wooden rod, marking each farmer's share. Taxes were demanded in grain, stored for years of famine. But not everyone played fair. A group of workers gather outside a treasury house, shouting angrily. They haven't been paid their grain rations in weeks. Historical records show this actually happened. The first known labor strike in human history. The workers of Deir el-Medina laid down their tools and refused to build tombs until their payments were made. Even in the land of pharaohs, even in the shadow of the pyramids, financial injustice pushed people to revolt. The voiceover deepens. Corruption in Egypt's grain economy was so widespread that officials often skimmed from storage, leaving less of the starving population in times of crisis. During famines, grain prices skyrocketed, and those with wealth became richer as others helplessly sold their land, their cattle, and eventually their freedom. The pattern of economic inequality was carved into history long before modern times. But across the Indus Valley and later the Mauryan Empire, something revolutionary was happening. The world's earliest banking principles were being born. Merchants carried small rectangular seals instead of bags of coins. These seals acted like credit passes. A trader arriving in a distant town could hand over a seal at a guild house and receive the equivalent amount in local currency or goods. No risk of being robbed on long journeys. No need to carry gold. It was the ancestor of the check system. The ancient Indian hundi not only simplified trade, but also created trust across hundreds of miles. In a dimly lit workshop, artisans carved coins out of shining metal. The Mauryan Empire introduced standardized punch-mark coins, the earliest signs of a state-regulated currency. The narrator explains how such coins strengthened central authority. When everyone used the same currency, taxes were easier to collect, trade expanded, and corruption became harder to hide. But even this system had a dark side. Tax collectors were infamous for harsh methods, and ancient writings describe how some farmers disguised their fields or hid grain to avoid excessive taxation. Economic pressure always pushes people into rebellion or secrecy. Another timeless truth. The documentary transitions to Rome, the titan of ancient finance. But this time, we step not into its grandeur, but into its growing cracks. On a cold morning, a group of Roman citizens gather before a magistrate, demanding justice. Their coins, once solid silver, now feel lighter, thinner. Nero had begun the practice of coin debasement, mixing cheaper metals into silver coins while keeping their face value unchanged. It was one of the earliest forms of state-controlled inflation. The narrator's tone becomes sharper. When emperors ran out of money to fund wars, games, or massive construction projects, they simply produced more coins with less precious metal. Prices rose. Trust fell. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Merchants hoarded goods. The people suffered. Rome didn't collapse in a day. It crumbled financially first. The empire that built roads across continents and armies that conquered nations lost its foundation because its currency lost credibility. Amid the ruins of an abandoned Roman marketplace, the voice speaks slowly. When a civilization loses trust in its money, it loses trust in its rulers. And when trust dies, nations follow. The screen fades to black for a moment. A heartbeat echoes. Then the narrator concludes a part with quiet intensity. The story of ancient finance isn't just history. It's a warning. Civilizations thousands of years ago battled corruption, inequality, inflation, debt, failed policies, and economic collapse. The tools changed. The mistakes did not. The ancient world's lessons on money, debt, and trade did not vanish with Rome or Egypt. They resurfaced, amplified, in the medieval and early modern period. Europe, emerging from centuries of feudal fragmentation, was hungry for wealth, expansion, and power. Kingdoms, tiny at first, began dreaming of global dominion. But armies, navies, and colonies cost money, a lot of it. For the first time, finance wasn't just local or regional. It became international, global, and deeply entangled with politics and conquest. England in the 1600s was still a minor player on this stage. Spain and Portugal controlled the riches of the New World. The Dutch dominated trade in the East Indies. France was building resources and armies to challenge rivals. Yet, England possessed something unique, the willingness to experiment with money itself. Debt joint stock companies, and investment became weapons as sharp as any sword or cannon. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was a cornerstone. Unlike previous systems that relied on monarchs' limited treasuries or the goodwill of nobles, the bank allowed the government to borrow vast sums from private investors. Each loan wasn't just money. It was a contract linking citizens' wealth to the empire's ambitions. Ordinary people, merchants, aristocrats, even small savers bought government bonds. Through the system, the state could wage wars far beyond its own immediate resources. Victory meant profit. Defeat could often be absorbed by the spread of risk across hundreds of investors. Debt was no longer a burden. It was fuel. Alongside the bank, private enterprises grew into instruments of empire. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, became much more than a trading firm. It collected taxes, raised armies, minted currency, and ruled territories with near sovereign authority. Investors in London weren't simply buying silk or spices. They were underwriting an empire. The company's wealth, built on exploitation, monopoly, and coercion, flowed back to England's financial houses, enriching the elite while ordinary people remained largely oblivious. Profit and power became inseparable. Empire and finance, once distinct, now moved as one. Slavery amplified this financial engine. Between the 17th and early 19th centuries, British ships carried millions of Africans across the Atlantic. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean became cash machines. Banks, insurers, and investors all profited from human suffering. When abolition finally came, the British government paid slave owners, not the enslaved, cementing wealth in the hands of those who had exploited generations. The capital generated through the system funded ships, armies, factories, and colonial expansion. The empire's foundation was dark money in every sense. India further exemplified this system. After the East India Company gave way to the Raj, India's resources became the empire's financial backbone. Taxes were converted into sterling bills, flowing to London banks and funding ventures across the globe. The home charges system ensured that revenue from colonies didn't enrich local populations. It enriched empire-wide operations. Indian peasants, often forced to grow cash crops at the expense of food, faced famines. Millions perished. But to London's investors, these payments were predictable returns, security for loans and bonds. Human suffering was abstracted into numbers on balance sheets. Finance had learned to detach itself from morality. Industrialization intensified the connection. Factories in England consumed raw materials from across the empire. Banks extended credit for shipments. Insurance companies covered cargoes crossing dangerous seas. Stock markets thrived on speculation, often disconnected from the human cost behind the profits. When American cotton supplies faltered during the Civil War, India and Egypt were coerced into increased production. Famine and death followed. Profit continued, uninterrupted. Empire became a vast, self-reinforcing financial machine, extracting value from people and land alike. Africa, too, fell into the web. The scramble for Africa was motivated as much by speculation as by strategy. Diamonds and gold attracted investors, floated on the London Stock Exchange, promising massive returns. Armies ensured security from mines and plantations, enforcing imperial claims with deadly efficiency. Wars like the Anglo-Zulu conflict and the Boer War were directly connected to these financial interests. Capital demanded protection, and the empire obliged. China illustrated one of the most explicit cases of finance dictating foreign policy. Britain's trade deficit with China over tea created a crisis of silver. The solution was opium from India. British merchants, backed by banks and insurers, flooded Chinese markets with narcotics. Millions became addicted, destabilizing society. When Chinese authorities tried to resist, Britain responded militarily, not to defend honor or diplomacy, but to protect profit. The opium trade was empire in ledger form. Coercion and violence converted into cash flows back to London's markets. Despite the scale of these operations, average Britons remained largely unaware of the financial infrastructure behind empire. Newspapers celebrated exploration, conquest, and naval victories, but rarely reported the role of investors, bankers, or companies in underwriting the empire. The power brokers, the directors, the financiers, the stock speculators operated largely in shadows, yet their decisions rippled across continents, shaping wars, economies, and lives. By the 19th century, Britain's financial dominance had reached global heights. London wasn't just a capital of the country, it was a central hub of international finance. Sterling became the world's reserve currency. Trade was priced, debts issued, and colonial administration funded from one city. The empire's red lines on maps were powered by black ink on ledgers. Wars, colonies, treaties, and markets, all tied to a complex web of financial mechanisms that few outside elite circles fully understood. Yet the system had cracks. Emerging powers like Germany and the United States were industrializing rapidly, building their own financial networks and competing in global lending. Britain faced challenges that its predecessors had never known. IT responded by binding colonies ever tighter into a financial orbit. Sterling preference, mandatory use of British banks, and tight control over foreign trade ensured that London remained the core of the system. Colonies became dependent on British finance for credit, investments, and market access. Empire wasn't merely political or military. It was financial infrastructure, and dark money powered every circuit. Even the Industrial Revolution relied on the exploitation of human labor and raw materials. Workers in Manchester and Birmingham labored for long hours under dangerous conditions. Yet the profits were funneled through financial instruments in London, feeding an empire that spanned continents. Industrial might, imperial ambition, and financial genius became inseparable. Empire had become a carefully orchestrated network, each part feeding the next, all underwritten by capital that few could trace and fewer could challenge. The narrator's voice softens as the scene lingers over maps, coins, shipping logs, and ledgers. The British Empire's greatness was never simply a matter of ships, soldiers, or territory. Its true power was its financial architecture, an interconnected network of debt, investment, and extraction that allowed a small island to dominate continents. Money didn't just follow empire. It created empire. As the 19th century unfolded, the British Empire's financial networks became not only global, but astonishingly sophisticated. London had grown into the world's most important market, where money moved faster than armies or ships. Bonds, insurance policies, shares, and loans were no longer confined to a local scale. They connected continents, colonies, and entire populations in a web of capital, often invisible to those who labored under its weight. What made Britain powerful was no longer just its navy or its army. It was the circulation of wealth, flowing with precision, fueled by human suffering, resource extraction, and sheer ingenuity in finance.